Today I'm going to try and encourage you to remain in your faith. And I think a big part of remaining in your faith is learning how to deal with doubt. My main theme, as you've already heard, is that there's more to knowing than knowing will ever know. Let me give you an example. Most of you probably know how to ride a bicycle. Most of you could probably go outside and jump on a bike and ride a bike. On the other hand, if there was a person who'd never ridden a bike before and they asked you how to ride a bike and asked you to explain it to them, you probably couldn't give them all the exact details. And then they might say, if they were sceptical, well, you really don't know how to ride a bike, do you? And you'd say, well, yes, I do know how to ride a bike. I just can't explain it to you. Because there's more to knowing than knowing will ever know. That's my theme today. I'm going to move on. Before I move on and talk a little bit about that, I'm going to give you a big picture. The big picture of the global setting that you're growing up in. I'm assuming that most of you are much younger than me. I'm going to suggest there are three really big issues that for the rest of your lives you are going to be dealing with at the global level. One is radical Islam. Where that goes, where Islamic State goes, where radical Islam goes, is a really important issue, obviously, in the world today. A second issue is climate change. Climate change is changing the world in dramatic ways that are going to have long-term effects, most of which we haven't seen yet. You know a bit about climate change, don't you? You know that most of the world's scientists are absolutely convinced that climate change is occurring. But have you caught on that climate change is a really good example of there being more to knowing than knowing will ever know? You know there are climate skeptics around the place. And the reason there are climate skeptics around the place is because no good scientist will say, we know that human beings are causing climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says there's a 98% chance. We are utterly confident that we are causing climate change. But science is like that, actually. Science doesn't give us that sort of absolute knowledge. The best scientists in the world say we're utterly convinced. They don't use the word faith, but you can hear that idea, can't you? The third issue that you're facing today is the issue that the new atheists are bringing up. This is an issue that Christians are facing. Radical secularism. A radical sort of worldview that says science is on one side, religious believers are on the other. Science is about certainty and proof. And remember what I just said about climate change. Science is about certainty and proof, and religion is about opinion or belief or something completely different. And that's the problem for Christians. As they grow up, they get that sort of secret, scary sense that maybe if I really think about my faith, I'll discover that science disproves my Christian faith. Let me make a comment about faith and doubt. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. Doubt and faith go together all the time. Faith is what you have when you're utterly confident that climate change is occurring, but you can't be certain, you can't prove it to anyone. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. Let me give you another example of there being more to knowing than knowing will ever know. Let me share with you the marital troubles of one of my sons. One of my sons, some of you know him, is called Tim. Tim is married to Olivia. They're going to give us our second grandchild in March. Our first arrives in January. Anyway, they've got marital troubles because Olivia barracks for Hawthorn and Tim barracks for Geelong. And when they got married 2 years ago, Hawthorn and Geelong were sort of equally yoked. But if you know anything about football, you'll know that things have gone bad. Hawthorn is pretty close to the top of the ladder and Geelong is way down here. Anyway, imagine Tim and Liv go to the MCG and they sit on opposite sides of the MCG and there's 100,000 people there, opposite sides because it's a Hawthorn-Geelong match. At the end, Tim's looking for Liv in a crowd of 100,000 people. How will he recognise her? Well, to cut a long story short, he can't tell you how he will recognise her, but he knows that he will recognise her. Because there's more to knowing than knowing will ever know. No, there is no way that he can describe Liv. How many minutes have I got? Sorry? No, how many minutes have I got left? 6. Oh. There's no way that he can describe Liv in a way that you or I, if we hadn't met her before, could just look in the crowd of 100,000 people and say, that's her. But he knows with absolute confidence that when he sees her face, he will know her. There's another example of there being more to knowing than knowing will ever know. So if that's the case, and if that's the case about science too, how come the new atheists are able to promote their line that there is a fundamental conflict between science and faith, that science is on about proof and certainty while faith is not? How come? Well, I want to give you about 400 years of philosophical history. It all started in 1650 with a man called René Descartes who sat in his armchair, closed his eyes and said, I want absolute certainty. Now, I'd love to give you the long story, but I can't. Some of you will study philosophy one day and you'll look at his first meditation. You all know his conclusion though, or one of his early conclusions. One of his early conclusions was, can someone give it to me in Latin? English? I think, therefore I am. Yep, I think, therefore I am. That is the thing I can be absolutely certain about. Descartes set us on a quest of 400 years of philosophical searching for certainty. And it's only in the last 50 and 80 years that we've realised that there's more to knowing than knowing will ever know. We will never reach that point that we hoped to reach. And the response is something we call postmodernism. Postmodernism is the response to the end of the Cartesian quest for certainty. But the interesting thing is, in that same 400 years, science as we know it has arisen, and science as we know it has arisen because of hundreds of well-known names who are the fathers, mostly fathers, of modern science and also committed Christians. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Descartes himself, Bacon, the other Bacon, Boyle, Bernoulli, Maxwell, Faraday. If you've studied any physics, any maths, you will know some of these names. Lavoisier gave us chemistry. All committed Christians. Newton, his theology was a bit off, but he was a committed religious person and also wrote probably the greatest scientific textbook ever written, next to Darwin's Origin of Species maybe. All committed Christians who saw no conflict between science and faith. Today in Australia, one of the most powerful men in Australia, tomorrow morning will be playing guitar in his Baptist church, sees no conflict between science and faith. I'm talking about Glenn Stevens, the chairman of the Reserve Bank, which on the first Tuesdays every month sets the interest rates in Australia. Other people around the world, you may have heard of Francis Collins, who headed the Human Genome Project, who now runs the National Institutes of Health for the US government. Committed Christian, absolutely top-notch scientist. There is no conflict between science and faith for these people because they understand that science too is about faith in a certain sense. Let me finish with another Australian, a guy called Graham Clark. Graham Clark invented the bionic ear. Graham Clark lives in Eltham. He's a humble Christian guy, also one of Australia's top scientists, perhaps Australia's next Nobel laureate, next person to win the Nobel Prize in medicine. Maybe, if he stays alive long enough. They tried to kick him out of Melbourne Uni because they said that the youngest professor of medicine in Australia, he's a crackpot, it can't be done. He walked the streets of Melbourne shaking a can to raise money for the bionic ear. Now he's a world famous scientist. He's won just about every science prize in the world. Graham Clark talks about his faith and says, my faith, my Christian faith, and my faith in the bionic ear are very similar. You have this belief, you're absolutely convinced about something, you step out with commitment and you go for it. He didn't know that the bionic ear would work. He couldn't prove that God existed because there's more to knowing than knowing will ever know. But he went on. So, what I want to leave with you is, if you want to remain in your faith, you have to remember that faith and doubt go together. Faith is opposite to certainty. There's more to knowing than knowing will ever know. And when you get that scary feeling that maybe actually faith is just, on this side of your brain, and you better not let this side of your brain, which is doing science, meet with this side of your brain, which is doing faith, you don't have to have that fear. There's a long history of people to encourage you, and there's lots of them alive still today. So remain in your faith. There's more to knowing than knowing will ever know.